Welcome back, Guardians. My name is Samlab. This is an exciting and unique opportunity to discuss the lore of Destiny, the current seasonal story narrative, and what the future beyond the Final Shape expansion in 2024 could look like. Today I will be joined by a special guest. My name is Bife, one of Destiny's largest content creators. Think of this like a seasonal lore ViDoc. You can expect a lot from this episode. Feel free to grab a cup of tea, coffee or juice. Sit back, relax, and enjoy the show. And today is a pretty big day. We have my name is Bife on the channel. It's been a long time in the making. I think we first encountered one another through a comparison tweet that I threw up one day. A great way to make a first meeting. But many of you know Bife. For those of you who don't, he is a Destiny lore content creator, and he's also known as the Lore Daddy of the Destiny community. And
I wondered if that was going to get brought up. I wondered.
I mean, it's you know, it's in your Twitter handle. We can't not.
It's run away from me now. It's completely left my sphere of control.
It's good banter. Yeah, thank you so much for being willing to have this conversation, have this chat. I think it's been a long time in the making for sure, but I think you just hit 1 million subscribers. Is that right?
Yeah, sometime around the release of Lightfall. But I mean, all of that aside, thank you so much for inviting me on Smart. I'm so glad we actually managed to find a time to get all of this done. Very much on my end of things. It's terrible scheduling, but yeah, I'm sad to be here, and I'm so glad that we're having this chat about all things Destiny lore in this season too.
Such a privilege to have the opportunity to be in this with you, and also to be part of the Destiny community with you. It's just, we have a unique opportunity to share perspectives, and I think you tweeted about this the other day, and learn from one another. I think in the beginning, everybody sort of, it can be semi-competitive, you know. It's behind the scenes, it's kind of like, why is this video doing better than mine this week?
And the reality is there is no discernible reason, and the algorithm kind of rules over all of us. Like, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to throw this out there too, in case there's anybody who has been directed over here from my side of the aisle. Keep your eye on Smart's channel. I mean, for the love of all things holy, the Old Chicago project behind the scenes looks phenomenal, and I want to see what happens when that releases, because oh my goodness, it looks as though there has been some serious quality as far as both the work and the voice talent that's gone into it, the quality of animation and whatnot. And that's just, you know, that's a landmark piece of content, but that says nothing at all about the already excellent quality of your day-to-day stuff. So yeah, I must say this now, I think that it's really, it's astounding to me that your stuff isn't more successful, but that's another reason why I'm going to be here, and I'm going to be happy to say, hey, send this man some subscriptions, you know, give him some likes, be in his comment section, make sure that you're actually supporting, feed the algorithm on everyone's end, please. But
yeah, thank you, thanks so much, James. It's a real that's kind of speechless. It's nice. It's good. It's good to be able to share each other's work. I think it's so important as creative people to be able to celebrate each other's wins, you know, and be there when we lose, because we can't always be winning. It's you can, but it's impossible to maintain for a long period of time.
I'd say this too, as long as a dialogue like this always exists somewhere in the community, as long as it's one of those things where everybody is able to put forward perspectives and be heard and contribute to the discussion, I see that as the first and most important win that we can always try and push for. I know that sounds very baited and whatnot. It's very sort of like, how generic a phrase that we're all winning as long as we're a part of this. But really, like, perspectives are more important than I think people realize, especially in this line of content creation when it's all about lore. But yeah, working to make sure that more perspectives around the community get heard. It's part of the reason why I'm so happy to be here, because you consistently raise points across your videos that I think are worth thinking about and worth pointing out. Because again, it's nothing about knowledge, it's if we've all got the same baseline. It's, as you say, perspective and understanding how one person's approach to thinking about something is not necessarily the same as someone else's, and how that creates that brilliant little kaleidoscope for us all to see the lore through. But yeah, I'm wittering on now, so my apologies.
No, witter away. It's very welcome. I think that it is possible to remain in your own head too much. I know that I struggle with this a lot, as being somebody who's neurodivergent. We've talked about this on and off, and we will get into like the main meat of this video before everybody's wondering like, what is this? There's no Destiny lore happening here. But I think it's good to be able to have conversations like this, as you mentioned before, and share thoughts and perspectives. So on that note, we're gonna jump right in here to basically give everyone a brief catch up. So we've just entered Season of the Witch in Destiny. Previous season was Season of the Deep, and this season has been all about the Hive and Eris Morn, in particularly the relationship between the Hive siblings has been a major play in terms of the story, weekly story, and the story beats from the past and present, and then maybe just touching on a little bit of the future. But if you can, I wanted to ask you to share a little bit about why the current events in this season have stood out to you a lot. I know that you've kind of peppered those thoughts a little bit throughout your recent videos, but I'd love to hear a little bit more about that.
So starting with a bit of a meta kind of thing, as opposed to diving immediately into the story, by the time that we were approaching Lightfall, before Lightfall was properly released, Bungie acknowledged a bunch of criticism to do with the idea that the seasonal formula was getting a bit stale, and that by the time we reached this season we're in currently, we would start to see a shake-up to the way that things are being performed. And I think that at very least the first signs of that shake-up and how they intend to approach things going forward is really visible. On the gameplay side of things, you're looking at stuff like the Deck of Whispers and the way seasonal activities work. But on the lore and narrative side of things, I think that they've changed the story content itself to make it so that it's a lot more condensed and is a lot more respectful of people's time. It has highlighted a few bits and pieces here and there that can be changed and shifted. Overall, I think it has been for the better, though. As far as the actual events within Destiny, though, I think that this represents one of the most interesting seasons that we've had in a long, long time. Season of the Deep technically gave us these massive reveals for story, right? I mean, you actually understand at the end of the Season of the Deep the origins of the Witness, our main enemy from the entirety of the Light and Dark saga, as it turns out, that's been building for the past 10 years. And yet, strangely enough, that doesn't feel as impactful in some ways as watching a character that we've known for that whole time, aka Eris, transforming into a literal Hive god. The god of vengeance as well, which is fitting to her in particular for a bunch of different reasons. But it taps into, I think, what a lot of old school and new Destiny players really associate as some of Destiny's best content, which is all to do with the Hive, which is all to do with the strong characters of the Hive gods themselves, and is all to do with their overriding personalities and how they relate to each other. And this season directly taps into all of that. You're looking at Eris Morn, who is seen by Xivu Arath as this new hatchling sister who has joined them in godhood and is mantling Oryx. You have Savathun, even though she is dead, sort of still being this persistent force in the background, this kind of miasma over the entire story that still plagues everybody with doubt. And then you have Eris herself and the way that she is actually interacting with the Hive power, what it is physically doing to her, and also the corruption that it potentially represents that she is consistently having to stave off. The fact that she clearly is capable of doing that and clearly is someone who has earned our trust dozens and dozens of times over, but still is in a terrible amount of danger because she is going up against Hive gods. It's a fascinating season as far as I think just the sheer volume of the change that this can bring into the lore, if that makes sense. This feels a little bit like the kind of lore that you'd expect out of an expansion rather than a season. You know, the creation of a whole new Hive feels like something that's worthy of another expansion on its own, let alone being the kind of side note of, oh, and by the way, they're fighting Xivu Arath. You know? There's a lot of good stuff this season, and I think that's really kind of at the core of it all. It takes good themes that Destiny has always had real strength with, and it throws them all into the blender together.
Yeah, I think you touched on a lot of really important and exciting aspects to the development, even into this season. It's quite interesting because whilst we can't compare Season of the Deep and Season of the Witch, I always like to compare. I always like to not compare, but sit them side by side and look at them like short stories. You know, if they were books, and noticing the subtle differences in tone. You can always tell because of whoever the writer is, but then also paying attention to the connective tissues that link from, say, for example, just as we're talking, D1 into Season of the Deep, and then from Season of the Deep back to maybe like Season of the Worthy, and then from Season of the Worthy back to Season of the Witch, and Season of the Witch into Season of the Deep, and then bouncing back again. I think the Hive relationship, the relationship amongst the Hive in general, it is and has always been like one of the most fascinating stories, I think, in Destiny, and it really is the biggest. It's a dynasty, you know, that spans billions and billions of years of culture and conversations. And it's what's been really exciting this season, I think, especially, is getting context to pieces of conversations we had little lore entries about, you know, or long lore entries about, and how there was more to it than that. And I think one of the weeks, it was either week 2 or week 3, where we heard for the first time the Ahamkara brought up and mentioned in relation to the Ecumene and, well, the Ecumene, and how the Ahamkara played a pivotal role. And it's really funny because we hadn't really had any mention of the Ahamkara, and we hadn't even really had any idea of who Xivu Arath was up until this point. And so giving her lines and bringing her to life and seeing her converse with her sister Savathun and getting like a taste of their dynamic as siblings, I thought was really interesting. And if I think for anybody who has siblings, you understand, you know, the eldest sibling, and then the Savathun's like the middle child, and then Xivu Arath is like the spoiled baby baby sister or baby brother, whatever you prefer. But and how for her, she saw everything that Oryx did as love, which is crazy. And it shows you, it's so subtle, the impact of what, you know, the narrative team have done there, because they're saying whatever influence was around Xivu Arath is what she took in, despite the fact that obviously, you know, they took the deal, the bargain that the worm gods gave them. But I think for Ziva Arath, it went a little bit deeper than that, because the way she lives her life, she lived based on the example that Oryx set, which is why when Eris Morn shows up, like you're saying, it
changes her whole world, right?
Right. It's like, oh, this new family here, because there's this huge void that we've had with Oryx being gone. And then obviously Savathun's like super cynical and doesn't really get what Ziva Arath is talking about per se. So it's interesting to see the dynamic. So is there anything that we got more detail on during this season that's gotten you really excited?
I mean, I remember last week, roughly, depending on when this was released, the first mention of the Imbaru Engine was a moment which I read all the stuff as it appears in game, and I read the quest step, and they made no mention of it in the prior conversation. They just said, "Oh, we've discovered a secret of Savathun's Oubliette at the Spire," and I was like, oh, "Okay, cool." And then they go on a lot about explaining Ayat, and it goes on a bit of a different, twisted conversation. And then they just casually drop Imbaru Engine in the objective that you have to do next, and that, it was a little bit like having all the caffeine of your coffee hit at once, and suddenly you are awake. The fact that Bungie is taking a concept like that and trying to manifest and embody it in a gameplay sense as opposed to just in the lore is really exciting to me. I know that some people have sat there and looked at the Imbaru Engine and they don't really care, but I think that's universally people who aren't really into the lore and don't understand what it represents and how dangerous it really is. Us just discussing it here technically creates Imbaru to an extent, which is this is why it's so cool. They've unpacked this brilliant metaphysical concept and have placed it so firmly in our side of the court that if we do return that, we need to be absolutely prepared to understand what the ramifications and the consequences are, and we don't. And it's brilliant. It's a writing technique that is genius. But as far as how we Guardians in the story interpret it as well, it's just adding to the mystique of Savathun. That was a moment that really blew me away, because again, it shows that Savathun, even beyond death, is still having this massive impact on the story. It also is really nice because, Imbaru has technically been around since Forsaken with the Truth to Power book, and we've never had any real concrete confirmation of anything in it because no one can trust Truth to Power. That lore book has been described as brain poison, and rightly so. It's not trustworthy when it switches perspectives the whole time and says, "Oh, but this time I'm being honest. This is the real me. I promise. I swear." But having them actually bring it back into the forefront is a really bold move, I think, and I think that really blew me away. I also have to say, I really do love that they're leaning into the idea of Xivu constantly communicating. It's I don't know if it's something that necessarily blows me away from this season alone, because we obviously had it in Season of the Deep previously, but I do enjoy that we're really getting an idea of who Xivu is as a character. She is, in a certain sense, best described by the word of zealot. She approaches practically every situation from the approach, I think, of faith. And the reason that that's so important is because faith, for the most part, is impossible to disprove because it's not about proof, it's about belief.
Yeah.
And with her belief being as strong as it is, understanding that she has clung to the sword logic, and for the most part it has been wholly successful with a few exceptions like Oryx, she has been able to build an entire worldview that is unflappable to her. It's completely set in stone. So Eris appearing and Xivu Arath then turning around and saying, "Oh yes, of course, this was all part of the plan. You see, this is exactly how it was meant to be. Now grow with sword logic and tithes and violence." It's perfect as far as the writing and characterization is concerned, because it just goes to show exactly who she is. It's one of the things that I'm really fascinated to see this season is if we do get a big final confrontation next week, because I presume next week is the finale of the story.
Yeah.
If we do get that big confrontation between Eris and Xivu Arath, will that faith suddenly break? And if it does, what is that going to look like? What is going to happen? What does that do to the Hive? What does that do to Xivu? What does that do to everyone involved in this situation? And does it potentially split her away from the Witness? There are a myriad of different questions that come across, and I think that's at the core of everything to do with Xivu's character that we're going to start to see sort of broken down. I really want to see how that progresses.
Me too. I think you're right, because everything is hinging on this. It's been a build-up. It's a build-up to this moment. What I find fascinating is the fact that Eris is furthering the development of not just Hive magic, but the sword logic itself and what that means. And we've had like this interesting comparison throughout the season, especially from Imbaru, of the fact that Guardians are more like Hive than we ever realized. In fact, we almost live by the same logic of strike teams and conquering and taking your enemy out before they have a chance to do anything to you, and this perfection of process, which is essentially what we as what the Vanguard exist to do, is not only push back the dark, because obviously if we go back to D1, the premise was very, especially when our Guardian first emerged from the graveyard, was that we're supposed to join on the Guardians who are fighting the battles all over space, wherever, on the front lines, and push back the light.
Push
that
back
was
the nebulous darkness, right?
Yeah. And the speaker was really interested in seeing us do that. So when we compare that to, Guardians have always been like the Hive, that's a big thing to say. And then to see Guardians utilizing the sword logic in its most literal sense of what it means to live and die by the sword logic, there's a huge parallel. Because if we were just going to compare one of the Hive gods to a Guardian who is essentially ascended to godhood, well, both can die and come back again, albeit not in the same sense, because as you mentioned this week and week before, and I think Mylan Games mentioned this as well, and the idea of throne worlds and how throne worlds are made. And we saw this with a Mindbender, I want to say,
Yes,
one of the Barons.
Mindbender.
The Mindbender. And when Cade 6 died, he used Cade's death, or I should say, the death of Cade's ghost was the catalyst that, produced the power that he needed to create his own throne world.
Yeah.
We have now, as Guardians, we don't have a throne world per se, but we're able to come back with the light.
Even in Witch Queen now, the Hive Guardians are using a lot of our own similar powers too, right? The lines continue to blur.
Definitely. And it's like two sides of the same coin, refining these sword edges. It is the sword logic, and the sword logic is the final edge, that final shape that is supposed to be the victor, and whatever that shape looks like, the Hive have always been striving towards it through combat and through war. That wasn't the Witness's intention of the final shape. It was almost like one of the loose ideas he had to what the final shape could become, and makes the Hive almost seem like an experiment in that long process of refinement.
I don't know about you, but it brings up that, do you remember the one lore card from the Root of Nightmares raid, where it's from an unknown disciple, and it's showing, right, all these
disciple.
these varied interpretations of the final shape, all of which seem to be at odds. There's Rorks, there's Savathoons and the Hives, there's whoever theirs is, there's the interpretation of Nezarek, and all of them seem to be at odds. And the final conclusion, of course, is I don't need to know it. As long as you know it, and as long as it does indeed bring about perfection, then who knows? Maybe it is indeed going to be so all-encompassing that everyone's perspective is actually correct on it, and it will be all these things, despite that clearly not being possible. But yeah, it leads to some really fascinating places, and yeah, I think the similarities between sword logic, the way the Guardians have been indwelling within that power, the way that the Hive have existed, they're absolutely there, and it's only become more apparent this season. It's built to that for years, really, which is what's really fascinating. And now I think the only difference is intention. You know, Guardians do this to defend the people of the city, and the Hive do this because sword logic is what drives them in itself. You know, we may use it, they live it.
Yes, yeah, definitely. I think that is clear from the way that Eris has her behavior and her treatment of refining it or turning it into something better. But what's ironic about that is that she's fallen into a trap, and it's really interesting, and I bring this up intentionally because I'm not sure if everybody has picked up on that the three Hive siblings and I'll use their courts as an example, are interlocked or interwoven, and they work in conjunction with one another, if that makes sense. Oryx's court is all about the perfection, it's the school, the perfection of the sword logic. And Zivu very gradually sort of has hinted at the idea that by Eris doing what she's doing, you're furthering the development of this thing that we live by and that we use. She seems to realize, but she believes that she's in control of it. And so it's going to be really interesting to see next week how that all concludes.
I'm actually fascinated to hear a little bit more about this. Are you, by talking about the relative courts and whatnot, you're basically saying that Eris is making her equivalent to the Black Terrace or the High Coven or the High War, correct? Am I getting that right?
Yeah, so in a sense, so there's a law entry, and I'm gonna do this on the fly because anytime I have these conversations, I always make the mistake of not quoting the right law book, and I know that it's important for people who are listening right now, and I have it thankfully in my previous notes. But it is the Grimoire card, the High War, verses 3-2. And I'm just going to read the last paragraph for context. So it says, "At last the many moons come to many worlds, and it was time to go to war on life. Oryx said, I shall establish a court, and whoever comes into this court may challenge me. My court will be the High War. It will be a killing ground and a school of the sword logic we have learned from our gods." Savathun thought that this was a great idea. She made the court called the High Coven. Zivu said, "The world is my court, wherever there is war." And so, what I noticed about this was the similarities between the three courts. And Oryx was really strategic, I thought, because it's like, okay, if anyone's ever going to practice the sword logic, it's mine. Like, you're operating within the parameters of what I do, what I stand for. And then Savathun's like, oh yeah, okay, this is a great idea. I'll make a court of High Coven. And I found it really curious that we didn't really get a definition of what Savathun's court actually does or is for. And then Ziva Wrath was like, I'm war. Like, if you're going to fight, you're tithing, it's all going to come back to me. But
Right.
What's interesting about Savathun's, I think, is I feel like she's laid, like, when you, I can't remember which game it is, but you used to have like trap cards, and trap cards were triggered if somebody
Yu-Gi-Oh?
rolled a dice or, yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
And so I feel like Savathun's laid a trap card, and whatever the case, she's benefiting from both Oryx's school of thought and Ziva Arath's school of thought. And so whoever wins or loses between Eris or Ziva Arath, my thinking is that she will come out on top. And I think we got a sense of that with the Imbaru engine, because that's like it's a backup plan for backup plans.
I need to double check this, but if I'm not mistaken as well, I want to say that there's a note stating that the power that's gathered within the Oubliette, aka the Altars of Summoning, is partially being siphoned upwards, which is the direction of the Imbaru engine. I'd need to double check that because it's dialogue from a character somewhere in the season, I believe, and there's 10,000 different sources in Destiny Lore Vault that I'd need to look through for that. But
yeah,
you know, it's all of the conflict that's happening between Xivu and Eris is happening on Savathun's doorstep in an area that she has specifically set up for a certain objective. We don't know what that is or was, but we do understand that the Witch Queen doesn't do things without any good reason. I think also it's worth remembering that the word oubliette, as was helpfully defined by Savathun at the very beginning, is a prison where the only escape is upward. And so that implies by its very nature that there is only one way they get out of this, and it's through the Imbaru engine, if that makes sense. I think that the conflict we're seeing in the Altars of Summoning, and potentially the conflict that we'll see next season, is something that only truly ends and gets resolved through that engine. And that really reinforces, to me at least, this idea that yes, absolutely, you're right, Savathun is totally going to be the real winner of this, even though she's not really sitting at the board. Even in death, I think she's going to be more powerful. I don't think I'm wrong either in saying that the Imbaru engine freaks me out purely because of the first week, when you succeed and you are actually choosing all the correct chests. It says you have conjured cunning, at which point you immediately, if you know the lore, think back to the Books of Sorrow, and you think back to the destruction of the Ecumene, and that moment where Savathun and Xivu Arath are both respectively summoned back with war and with trickery.
Mm-hmm.
And the exact wording is, I am trickery and you have conjured me back with trickery. And it's a very important set of words based on that alone. It is trying to evoke that sentence. It's trying to evoke that idea. So the fact that the Imbaru engine is going around and now has done that for Xivu Arath as well, it creates a very interesting set of questions as to what's going on with the further purpose of that. And if this entire conflict wasn't something that was drawn out by Savathun and planned by her all along. And, you know, most recent lore from the week 6 of the seasonal story, contingency plans, I believe it's called.
Yeah.
Yeah, that really goes to show that Savathun has absolutely seen out all the different possibilities. There are scenarios upon scenarios upon scenarios that she's planned for. And it's mildly terrifying to see how in depth she has gone with all these plans. We are absolutely walking into a trap. I just don't know what it looks like, and I don't know where the snare is, so to speak. And yeah, I would love to believe that Eris is actually drawing Xivu into a trap and will break her faith, cause her to go after vengeance purely for vengeance sake, and then, you know, feed Eris with a great tithe, so to speak. But I don't know, I feel like all of that is just sort of like the child's play that's going on in the foreground, where in the background Savathun is actually the master manipulator yet again.
I think you nailed it, because just the idea of the Imbaru engine is very odd for somebody who already has their own ghost. And it makes me wonder, is it possible for her to be, this is a hypothetical, if Savathun was resurrected herself through the Imbaru engine, because it's made it pretty clear that every time people go into the Imbaru engine, this oubliette, we're conjuring cunning, and
we're giving her power, right?
Right, that's going somewhere. So it's going to be interesting to see how that setup is going to play out next week. and it does like you said, it's an exciting development. I wanted to ask you what you thought about Eris's plan. And so we know that she called out to several worm gods and Arsa responded, which is interesting because obviously she would have had to have known that Arsa was going to respond to that call immediately. Otherwise, she wouldn't be able to adopt this Hive morph. So, and we know that this is a dangerous a very dangerous thing that Eris has done, because Arsa can potentially die if Eris doesn't stop, and Ikora is worried that Eris isn't going to be able to stop.
I'm again going to refer people to contingency plans, because the fascinating bit of lore there states that Savathun always predicted that Eris wouldn't be able to gather enough tithing, and that the only way she was going to be able to gather enough power was to destroy the entire Vanguard. Their words entirely. This lore entry that dropped yesterday is fascinating. It's so interesting, because again, that's Savathun's prediction, which is oftentimes going to be pretty correct. Not always, because she is fallible. We saw as much in Witch Queen. But the fact that that's something that she was giving as a contingency plan and part of the information she was sending to Imbaru tells us something. It tells us that she really doesn't think Eris has it in her to actually gather enough power to defeat Xivu. It tells us the extreme lengths and steps that she thinks she'll be willing to go. There's a bunch of other things in that entry that are made clear and that are also not made clear at all, because there's talk of all sorts of stuff that I don't think I truly understand just yet. But it goes to show that when you're dealing with the finale of this story and this season, you're going to actually be looking into a real concert of power. There are 3 or 4 different moving parts to all of this, and it's still not clear which ones will come out on top. It's very clear which ones are more powerful for the moment. You know, there's a very clear hierarchy here. The only thing that's going to be interesting about it is how each part moves in concert and upsets each other. I'm very excited to see how it goes, but yeah, I don't know. The idea of what Eris does is going to be something I look forward to expanding on very clearly. I personally think that it's going to be a hollow victory for us. I think that it's likely going to be the case if we get technically what we needed with the information that Savathun has, this key to being able to go into the pale heart of the Traveler and follow the witness. But I don't think for even a second that it's going to be a complete victory. I think there is going to be a cost to be borne. What I will also say is I don't think it's going to be Eris's fault. I think it's just going to be that Savathun played everyone like a fool yet again.
I think you're right. That's, Savathun, the level of scope that she has as a character, she's maniacal. There's no way she's outplanned her own plans, and there are so many tier levels of her contingency that even Imbaru doesn't know, but she's given him instructions to be able to tell us what to do in each step, as if she had seen the future and knew exactly what would happen, where we would go, what needs to be done. She knew that we would discover the Imbaru Engine. She knew that Eris would end up calling on Arsa, and yeah, it's really interesting. Which means she's known about Arsa being on Titan, a scary suggestion, and whether or not the narrative team would go that far would be crazy. But we know that they're not, because for various reasons. But yeah, at least we hope.
It's very clear that the Vanguard is not just going to die. You know, they're in final shape. We know that much. We know they're going to be there, but the implication is terrifying, right? You know, it gives you an idea of the vacuum of power that needs to be filled in order to meet the moment, and that in itself is scary.
It would be interesting if Savathun was accruing all that tribute not for herself, to put Oryx back on the chessboard, as it were. How that would make any sense, I don't know. This is just me speaking off the top of my head, but even the idea of Oryx's body being written into the previous season and him being mentioned so much even now is quite interesting. I think there's nothing in a story gives a character more power than suggesting the idea that, hey, look, they're still around. They're not really dead. This is the Hive, but you know, there is the potential, if done right, that they could come back again. Destiny's story pick up speed. I feel like season of the Witch it kind of threw everybody in.
I also have to say, this is not so much a commentary on the story, more on its presentation. I do appreciate that whilst I'm always going to be a proponent of having more story moments and having more stuff that happens, I do appreciate that there isn't as much kind of, I suppose, predictable busy work to it. I mean, the thing that I think about is every week we needed to find some coral to feed to Asa, and you know, back in the season of the Plunder, every week we needed to find one of Nezarek's relics, and you know, go back to however many seasons and you can find repeating examples of this. And I am so glad that we're kind of, even if it is leaving some weeks feeling a little bit shorter, I'm glad we're stepping away from that formula, because I'd rather have something short and sweet than something which just feels as though it pulls people along and makes the story predictable. It's a pacing thing more than anything else. I'd rather have something that is short, quick, and a one-note thing that's very important and impactful than something that feels as though it's dragged out over the case of 30 minutes when it could have been 5. You know? I think that's it's not just about being respectful of the player's time too, it's also better for the tempo of the story. That being said, when they do drop these massive weeks like they did in the first couple of weeks of the season of the Witch, it's really good. And it's selfish to a certain extent, and I know that it's very difficult when it comes to actually creating all of this content, but I do wish that every week in the seasonal story could be like that. You know, these really rich and dense narrative developments, these important character moments where it's very clear that people are struggling against each other or in combination with each other. I really want more of that, and I want it to be brought forward into the story more, as there's always going to be the case. I feel as though Season of the Witch takes a step in the right direction, but there's still work to be done on that front of things. I will say though, it's very gratifying to get those really big, juicy story weeks.
Yeah, I definitely agree with you. I think that condensement of narrative in an approachable way is 100% is the go-to moving forward. I think that the cadence is much appreciated, especially for players who don't have time to sink 10 hours into experiencing the story. I mean, take us, for example, as content creators. You spend more time telling story than you do actually playing the game. And it's kind of like, I don't know about you, but for me, it's when I have my downtime, do I get the opportunity to really like sink my teeth into, okay, what are the ritual activities this season? What are the drops I really want to get? What are the armor sets I'm desperate for? Versus there's a lot of lore that I need to read, take in, digest, script, 5 to 10 scripts back to back to back. And sometimes you miss out on like discovering the fun things, but I think that's the exciting part about what Season of the Witch has offered. It's kind of given us all this interlocked synergy when it comes to the content that we're making. They've mapped things out in a way that works well for everybody for the most part, apart from when there's technical difficulties. Right. Yeah.
I will also, I'm echoing what you're saying absolutely, because there's a lot of merit to what's being done here. I will also say that I think that where there have been bespoke moments this season, they've done quite well. The introduction of the new encounters within the Oubliette for the Altars of Summoning was a very good example of that. The early reveal of what I think is probably going to be the final boss of the season, aka Zivu's champion, aka the Leviathan Eater,
Yeah.
That's all really good stuff. I think it makes a very strong presence within the world and on the actual stage for the game, but I think that those will always be a preference over something like, say, go out there and just complete 5 ulcers of summoning encounters. We're already doing the seasonal activity. It's already happening in the background. Having it be another part of the story doesn't necessarily make it actually something players will think is worthwhile. You should assume that people are already doing that, or you should assume that the living world of Destiny is doing it in the background. It's already happening, So I appreciate that. But bespoke moments, I really appreciate. I think that those are where we should try and direct the story going forward.
I agree, and it certainly sets precedent and gets us all excited for whatever season 23 is going to be. Hopefully, that the story is continued, but just with larger pieces of development, as it were, because I think they've set up a lot this season that requires delivering on. They've put a package together that is complete, but there are aspects to it still missing that need to be not teased but delivered on, so that we feel as players as. So I want to move on to our next point, and we didn't get the opportunity to ask the community for questions, but if you do have any questions, please feel free to leave them in the comment section down below. We have talked a lot about the Hive dynasty. We've talked a lot about the developments of Eris and Ziva Arath's relationships. So I want to take us a little bit further afield, and this is something that I do quite often, and I did this with a couple of videos on the channel recently, but we have the next expansions in 2024, and it was funny because I was watching the video that you did with Unknown Player, and there was something that you talked about when discussing episode 1, which is Echoes. That's the episode that's coming next, post the final shape. What do you think the story of episode 1, Echoes, is going to be about?
I think that the only clear thing we have at current is that it ties into the Vex and how the aftermath of everything that's happened in the final shape will really affect them. We know that in some of the early interviews regarding seasonal content, episodic content, I guess I'll say, after that time period of the final shape, is supposed to center around the Vex and how they react to the conclusion of this saga and how it will be a big moment for them to make something of. I personally think, and this is just a prediction, and honestly it's a bit of a pipe dream and a hope, but I hope that Echoes starts to show us the beginning of a real collection of Vex personalities. And at that note, villains, antagonists, potentially even protagonists and heroes. The reason I say that is as follows. The Vex have a real problem as an enemy faction, I'll call them, I suppose, with just not being a group that you can put a face to. For the longest time, I think we had one real enemy within the Vex that we knew of by name that was really well established in the lore that we hadn't already killed. And that was Coria,
Yeah.
And Coria loomed large, and then the season of the Splicer, they were deployed as a final boss to the season, which, as part of the run-up to Witch Queen, makes a lot of sense. But the Vex have a problem with being inscrutable. They have a problem with being something that can't be well identified. And I think that what really would help is for us to be able to put various key Axis minds out there that are looking to perhaps take control of the Vex more generally, or that are looking to accomplish some other objective that applies to their overall consensus objective, which of course is to be the last living thing at the end of the universe. I want to see the Vex deployed in a way that makes that more interesting, because for the last 10 or so years, they've been mostly static in Destiny. They've turned up like robotic intergalactic parasites that just exist alongside things, whether that's on Neomuna or whether it's on Europa or whether it's now with, everything that went on with the Season of the Risen, you can even find some of it on Earth. There's a lot of
Right.
interesting stuff going on with the Vex as far as the pure technology and mystery of them is concerned, but I would love more character, and that's what I really want to see in Echoes. I want to see this moment where they can capitalize on that moment, where the light and dark are in a different kind of place, if that makes sense, where they're not necessarily the center of the universe, which I don't know if that's going to be the case, but I don't know, it seems to be the vibe that everything's getting, and where the Vex can step up, but in order to do that, they need to manifest some kind of series of personalities. I want to see that happen, and I want to see that get extrapolated and expanded out. That's my hope. But is that going to happen? I don't know. I just hope that Bungie is able to deliver that and deliver some dynamic storytelling over those few seasons.
I think you're right. The Vex are I was going to say species, but they're a complicated calculation, and I think you're right in the sense of that we haven't been able to fix them to any one characteristic, and I think that's been a double-edged sword in that it makes them absolutely fascinating to hear about, read about, research about, and even I was going to say witness, but examine as an entity within Destiny, in game or even within the pages of lore. But there is the struggle in that they're like that villain in a really old 90s, cartoon, and they show up and it's we're here to get you, and then they get dealt with, and then they're gone again, and then they come back again, and it's like
they are Starscream. They are
yeah,
Starscream,
yes,
right?
Yeah. They really are the embodiment of Starscream. It's an interesting conundrum. I think I would hazard a guess that it's been mostly intentional to sort of keep them in the story, but in the background until Bungie are ready to do something with them. But I think they cleverly gave us some setup with the Veil and the fact that the Vex are or were on Neptune. And a really fascinating point, and I love this and how they wrote this, was that the Vex embedded themselves into the history of Neptune. Because this is typically what the Vex do in general with any planet. They go back in time, make themselves a part of the history of that planet, so that in present time they are dominant or more dominant or more present or omnipresent, if people prefer. But I think the idea of Lakshmi working with the Vex or being an exo and some of those loose threads, and the idea of the Vex wanting to take hold of the Veil are interesting probabilities, I guess.
It's really only been Season of the Seraph that she's really come back into the prominence of the story, and even that, I think it would be fair to say that she's an important character, but she's nowhere near as relevant to that story as Aramis, Rasputin, and Anna Bray are, and to that extent also Mithrax. It's really that kind of confrontation between the lot of them. I think they're the core of this, and Elsie's much more of a supporting character for certain.
I think the lore community would be kicking me if I didn't mention Asher Muir. He's also been in the background, and there's also potential of Bungie using Asher to kickstart that season. Perhaps he's discovered something within the Vex network.
Here's an interesting addition to that. Now that he's been absorbed into the consensus properly, and that he has been kind of found and undone, so to speak, how does that affect anything, or does that affect anything? Is there a possibility that he has had that effect on the consensus more than they've actually had an effect on him, right? Because in the last few notes of the season, if you do finish up the, I believe it's if you get the catalysts for the Vexcalibur, you're able to unlock the Ghost Shell, and the lore for that seems to imply that Asher does get completely consumed. But again, strength of personality within the Vex network is something that's not really well measured, and it's something that could have an impact. And if someone at least has a strength of personality and, you know, in a very kind of like dogged sense where they would not give up and would always insist that they're correct, it would definitely be Asher. So like, does that have an effect, right? Like, is there something more to it, you know?
Mm-hmm.
Like, is there potential thing to hold some kind of manifestation still with that?
It's an exciting idea to expand on, because Asher he's a guardian, and so it's crazy to think that a guardian was able to be assimilated into the Vex network. And what's more is that if he's become part of the collective, where did his light go? So we've got this crazy far out idea of a guardian existing within a collective consciousness who had the light. And the Vex have always been everything about wanting to replicate the light, but they can't because it's paracausal. So that, there's room for story there too.
So that really does bring up a very interesting possibility, though, because Ashemir, of course, isn't the first either, right? And it kind of leads me back to the idea of the Vex personalities that you might see arising from the network, potentially being related to other guardians that have fallen there, or other people with strong enough personalities for that matter. I mean, the earliest examples I can think of are probably going to be Kabir, and if they existed, members 4, 5, and 6 of the first Vault of Glass fire team, which is a very interesting, hotly debated load of stuff. For those who do not know, the first fire team to raid the Vault of Glass was supposedly made up of Kabir the Legionless, Pradith, and Pahanin. You know, it was a fire team of 3, not a typical raid fire team of 6. However, the early grimoire seems to suggest that there might have been others that they just can't remember. And the interesting thing about that is that the Vex within the Vault of Glass in particular have control over time. They are able to expunge you from existence, which means it's possible that 6 Guardians did go in there and that 3 of them have been expunged, and that they no longer exist because the Vex removed them from the timeline. And if that is the case, do the Vex still have some kind of base memory of those 3? Or, for that matter, anyone else who fell within the consensus, who was absorbed by radiolaria, who was infected by Vex prions? All sorts of things that have happened to these personalities, and the Vex are known to keep hold of resources in case they should use them. It's the reason why Pradith still existed within the vault and was able to reach out to us in the Taken King. So the fact that these Guardians have interlocked with the Vex somehow and aren't necessarily completely lost is just a really interesting, tantalizing prospect, you know?
I agree with you. And there's also Brother Vance. I would hate not to mention him.
Yes.
He is in the Infinite Forest, so there is potential for him to re-emerge as well. And given the history that he had with Osiris, it would be exciting to have a Vex-related story, expansion, that side of Destiny, because I think we've had the last major season we had that really focused on the Vex really was the season of the Splicer, Curia, who, a character that was so, I would say, the lore heralded big time. The scope of Curia was so large that, like, I thought they were going to give him a Witch Queen-esque kind of treatment and make him like an expansion boss, but we were happy to settle with a seasonal boss. And I think, looking back, it's possible that he could have been a dungeon boss, but I don't think that Bungie were willing to do a bit like a large piece of content like a dungeon for purely the Vex, especially when we already had the Vault of Glass.
I think it's also the as far as Quaria's story is concerned, they're really it's definitely something where people would probably have been fine with seeing more of Coria as a character. I know there was actually a lot of desire for that. But by that same token, they are unquestionably one of Savathun's pawns to move across the chessboard. And the fact that they ended up being part of the lead-up and the story of Witch Queen, I think was an appropriate part for them in the story. Obviously, they do represent a really fascinating character, and I wish they could have done more, but, you know, I think it just goes to show on the more sort of further scoped out level that there is definitely an appetite for Vex characters that are named and have an impact on the story and have interesting parts to it, but yeah, we just haven't seen many beyond Coria, you know?
Yeah, I definitely agree, but hopefully we'll see something happen. We also have the second episode 2, which is Revenant, and Revenant is curious because we have no idea what that really is, apart from the fact that the fanatic known as Fikrol, his effigy, as it will, is what is represented in the prototype image. Any thoughts on that?
I think whenever you involve Fikrol, you're involving some key pieces. First of all, there's the Scorn overall as a whole, which it's clear that Fikrol has not been in command of ever since the Witness has come along, and I imagine that the Witness's destruction, which I have to presume is what happens in Final Shape, is going to be the thing that prompts Fikrol and all the stories of the Scorn to really evolve. Of course, the other big thematic aspects that are tied in with Fikrol's story are going to be Crow as formerly Aldrin, and also Cade 6, who it's not clear if he's able to leave the Pale Heart, but if he is, all of a sudden there is a lot to be said and probably shot at between the three of them. You know, it's a lot to do with those three characters, and I imagine that it evolves into quite a significant piece of character drama with all of them. There's also the fact that the Scorn, as Fikrol sees them, are kind of a pillar of why he exists. He sees them as his brothers and sisters and children. He sees them as family. And in that sense, you know, they are technically undead Elixir. They're undead fallen, but in Fikrol's eyes, they are their own people. They have their own standing, and he wants to make something of them. You know, he believes in vengeance for them. He believes in justice for them. And that in itself speaks to the idea that this is a people that may evolve all on their own, and that may be the thing about Revenant that really gets told in the story, is this idea that Fikrol, who again, because of wish magic and shenanigans to do with Riven, he cannot die, he will always resurrect. It's going to be one of those interesting stories where we effectively have to deal with him in one way or another. And I don't necessarily know if that's just going to be something that is truly offensive, as in, you know, us going out to fight Fikrol over and over and over and over again like it's Hollowed Lair 2.0. I think it might be something that's a little bit more structured in this sense of, okay, how do we reconcile our differences and how do we make it clear that, you know, as much as you may hate the Guardians and you may hate the Light because of what they've done to you in the past, the Witness did worse to you, and now you have the ability to rewrite your own story as a people able to choose for themselves. You know, I think I'd love to see a story like that, but who knows? Fikrol's not been in the story. He's been a wild card for years now, and I think that's what really drives the center of it. It's going to be all about his strength of personality, and we still don't know what his reaction is to Crow being a Guardian. That's going to be a moment. That right there will be a moment to see.
Yeah, I think so. I think you're right. The idea that he has been a wild card, I think, is one of the core aspects of his character that makes him fascinating. I think it's the same with every other wild card in Destiny 2. The fact that we have an ongoing story right now that potentially could tie them in, but they haven't been tied in. It's like, why are you not tying them in? We want to hear more from this character, and that's really exciting. But I think as well, between Aldrin between Crow and Cade, that's gonna be a big moment if that happens.
Yeah,
I'm hoping that Cade can leave the Pale Heart, and it's not like a one and done you're back in a dream, but then after that you're gone, kind of thing. With if the traveler dies, I don't know what Bungie wants to do there, because we know that Guardians have moved beyond light, but it's a scary idea with the idea that the light and darkness saga is coming to a end. Whatever end that is, it's going to be fundamentally different, I think, from what we're used to. I guess the last thing would be to share your quick thoughts on the third episode, which is Heresy. Given where Season of the Witch is right now, I think it's pretty clear to see what direction that story may be heading in, but do you have any further thoughts past that?
Man, if you were asking me this in 2 weeks' time and we knew rather, what the conclusion to the story is, this would be probably a fascinating discussion worthy of another half hour. But for the moment, I think it's going to really depend on what happens with the 4, and I will say 4 Hive gods, you know. Is Oryx still dead at that point in time? Is Savathun still dead, and is she still scheming somehow at that time? Is she alive again? Is she off doing her own thing? What's happened to Xivu-Arath? Has her faith been broken? Has her will to fight still persisted? Is this to do with her invasions? Is this to do with her battles over Tora Bartle? Is this to do with her interactions with the Cabal? And of course, last but certainly not least, what about Eris? You know, has she retained her status as a Hive god? Did she accomplish the mission and then just leave it behind as was her intention? Or has she been drawn further in? Heresy, for the Hive in particular, raises a very important idea though, which is that it is something in defiance of the sword logic. And that makes me wonder whether there is someone who is enacting that. The classic image of Heresy is necromancy for the Hive, as is portrayed by Nokris and his ability to resurrect a dead Hive. You know, the latest example that we saw with all of this was to do with Ghosts of the Deep, actually, and the attempt to resurrect Oryx himself. But we've seen plenty of examples of it prior to that. Pit of Heresy back in Shadowkeep was another one. I think that this, generally speaking, is going to lead to a question of what the Hive believe at their core and someone going against that belief. Someone perhaps seeing the sword logic and contorting and twisting it. How we as Guardians interact with that is a whole other question, but I'd be very interested to see what happens as time goes on, because any big movement with the Hive probably has to involve either one of their gods or an ascendant. And so anything that happens in Heresy season, needless to say, will involve all of that, and I'm very interested to see how that goes down.
Yeah, I think you're right. To add to that, I think that it is, again, this power struggle, because Eris is technically a fourth chess piece. If if Oryx did come back, I think that there's a potential of that, the throwdown being between the 4 of them, guessing at whether they are all still alive at the same time. We have no idea, but yeah, excited to see. But on that note, we're gonna wrap up right here, but I wanted to say thank you so much, James, for being on this episode. Hopefully we get to do more collaborations in the future, but I really appreciate you being here. So is there anything that you would love to share or announce with viewers that you have up and coming that you're allowed to share, or anything that you'd like to plug? This is your moment.
Normally I would plug all the stuff to do with my own channel and Twitter and all that other nonsense, but in this instance, go subscribe to Psalm Labs, please. Just stop it. Stop messing around and do it, please. If you've not hit the button already, I'm going to encourage you. It's somewhere down there in that side of the... Nope, it's down there, maybe. I don't know which way my camera is going on your side of the screen. Point being, it's down in the bottom right corner. Go hit it. Just go ahead and give this man a subscription and make sure that we appreciate the different perspectives that are throughout the lore community and really acknowledge some of the hard work that's been going on. I'll say this again like I did at the beginning, but I can't wait it can't go to release. I know it's always in
Thank you.
a state of production, and every time I get to see a little tease of it, it's really exciting. So I look forward to it. Seriously, I can't wait to see it.
Well, Guardians, thank you for tuning in. Thank you to My Name is Vive for taking the time to sit down and discuss what we all love and enjoy, Destiny lore. If you enjoyed this video, remember to leave a comment in the comment section down below, and also give this video a like. My hope is that myself and Name is Vive may be able to do this on a regular basis. Something special you can look forward to throughout the year, maybe a few times. This has been a unique and exciting opportunity. I have a lot more lore videos planned, so be sure to stick around. Remember that no matter what you're facing at this moment in time, you can do all things. Stay safe and Godspeed.